Now, welcome to the second chapter of The Last Archangel. Or the first chapter, because the last one was a prologue. Sorry. The Last Archangel is by Inuka Gakome. If you want to read it yourself, I will put a link in the description. Please tell me if I missed something up other than what I just said, because honestly, I know I got that wrong. But, chapter 1! Yay! The arc reactor was a heavy, hot weight in his chest, making every breath a struggle. He'd gotten somewhat used to the diminished lung capacity while in captivity, but struggling through the hot desert sands was really putting his endurance to the test. It wasn't that he'd been in bad shape, but the inability to breathe properly, compounded with dehydration, the heat of the sun, and the difficulty of walking through the sand, was really throwing Tony for a loop. He probably shouldn't have walked away from where he'd crash-landed in the suit, but something was pulling him. Besides, he wasn't used to just standing around and doing nothing. In any case, just standing there would have wreaked havoc on his shoes as the hot sand burned through the worn material. It wasn't like walking was doing him any favors either, but at least the effort of walking took his mind off the pain. He'd taken off his top layer in order to serve as a flimsy shield against the boiling sun. It did mean that his eyes were somewhat protected from the glare, although he was still squinting to see where he was going. There weren't any noticeable landmarks for him to check, and he tripped over his own feet more than not. But he doggedly continued on. There was some place he had to be, even if he didn't know where. In the back of his mind, far too silent, always too silent, was the thought that he was potentially walking away from any help that would come. That was if someone was still looking for him. 3 months after he'd been kidnapped. He was Tony Stark, but that didn't mean the military would be willing to extend their resources for a search and rescue mission for so long without hearing any word that he was still alive. Besides, even if they were still looking for him now, it wasn't like they'd find him anyway if they hadn't yet. The fact that he'd exploded the terrorist camp was a point in his favor, but then he'd blasted out of there and he was even now walking further and further away from where he'd landed. The math simply did not add up in his favor. Even now, the calculations in his head were telling him how hot the sun was, how hot he'd have to be before he suffered heat exhaustion, how much longer he could do without a drink of water, how much longer he could walk before failing due to lack of oxygen because he just couldn't breathe. It was when he was staggering over a dune that he noticed it. There was a tree at the bottom of the dune he was standing on. It was also where whatever he'd been following was leading him. Blinking blurrily against the ever-present sand in his eyes, Tony squinted down. He could be hallucinating, chances were that he was. But it wasn't like he had anything left to lose by checking out that beautiful tree that was smack dab in the middle of the Afghanistan desert. He lost his footing not even halfway down the dune and tumbled down the rest of the way. By the time he reached the bottom, his skin was burning, his breath was coming out in wheezes, and his left shoulder was in agony. Managing a couple of coughs, Tony struggled to a sitting position, checking to see that his makeshift turban was still intact before he squinted to see how close to the tree he had come. Now that he was at the bottom of the dune, he realized that what he had before. It was a giant bowl. The tree was sitting at the bottom of a giant bowl. The physics of it were so improbable that it took Tony several more than it should have for him to clear the math from his mind that told him this shouldn't be possible. Tony could understand something like a cactus or a straggly skeleton of what had been a tree being in the middle of the desert. What he couldn't understand was a thriving green tree that was really gigantic looming over him. It was the type of tree that could only survive with large amounts of water, but there it stood in the desert, practically daring him to deny its existence. Of course, chances were still that he was hallucinating the whole thing. Tilting over to kneel on the blazing hot sand, Tony rested back on his heels as he considered his next move. He was too damn exhausted to make his way back up the giant sand dunes surrounding him. It was also too dangerous for him to just stay down here because the math told him that the sand would and could and would shift to leave him buried with and without any way of digging himself out. But while the best choice would be for him to get to his feet and try to make his way out of here, something else was pulling him towards the giant ass tree that shouldn't be there. And considering it was the same thing that had led him to this goddamn place in the first place, Tony figured that he should at least appease it so that he could just dust his hands of the whole affair. Figuratively, since he couldn't dust his hands of anything surrounded by sand as he was. And then leave. Taking as deep a breath as he could manage considering his restrictions, Tony pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly as black spots appeared in his vision. His mouth was parched and his throat ached for want of water. The exposed skin on his arms was feeling tight due to sun exposure, and even his face was beginning to feel rather unpleasant. And yet he staggered forward, making his way determinedly to what was most certainly a hallucination brought on by heat exposure and dehydration. There was no shadow cast by the tree, given that the sun was as high as it was. Strangely, the sand seemed firm beneath his feet as he approached his goal, making it easier for him to walk. By the time he was only several feet from the base of the tree, the tugging that had drawn him there was so strong that it was only lack of strength that stopped Tony from sprinting the rest of the way, that and his belief that it was still a hallucination. Coming to a stop, an arm's length away from the trunk of the tree, Tony briefly tightened the grip he had on his left shoulder. He should probably reach out to see if he could touch before he tried anything, finding like walking through it. But first, he craned his head back to look up into the lush, bright green leaves adorning the branches. The leaves seemed just as real now as he was standing underneath them than when he had been standing from a distance. Looking back at the brown bark, Tony exhaled raggedly, closing his eyes briefly as his fingers gave a short spasm before he managed to take his hand off his aching shoulder. He opened his eyes as he reached out, tentatively, like wanting to see it as he touched the tree. His fingers trembled as they closed in on the goal. The first thing he registered as his fingers brushed against the bark was how coarse the bark felt and how real it was. Then everything was white, and everything he was poured into him as he inhaled with a gasp. He was Tony Stark. He was infinity. He was time itself. He was the messenger. He was the sand below his feet. He was the sun. He was Tony Stark. He was Gabriel. He remembered the first galaxies forming, the universe expanding after his father had decided it should exist, the eventual creation of the earth over millions of years, the formation of water where previously there had been nothing but molten lava and rock. He remembered standing by a seashore in his true form while watching a fish struggle out of water and onto the soil. He remembered when his father had created humans, when the order to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah had been given because they had been cruel and violated those they shouldn't have, when Jesus Christ had walked the earth, and when his father's voice had fallen silent because he had left. He remembered Lucifer, Samael, the morning star, being cast down because he dared challenge the Father for loving humans more than angels and for being ordered to love humans more than their Father. He remembered leaving heaven because he couldn't bear the fighting in his family, couldn't bear the silence of his father as their family fell apart. He remembered taking up the mantle of Loki, then the trickster, and then Gabriel once again when the Winchesters trapped him. He remembered taking on Lucifer because he decided that the apocalypse really wasn't worth it, really wasn't what his father had wanted, really wouldn't pull his broken family together after millennia of plotting and fighting. And remembered failing and Lucifer driving his sword through his chest and killing him in a blaze of dying grace. And now, he remembered being born Anthony Edward Stark to Howard and Maria. The silence that had always run through his head made sense as he realized that it was the voices of the host he had been missing. The voices of his brothers and sisters. Even when Gabriel had been absent from heaven, he had always heard the host. The ever-present feeling that he was missing someone was because he had always been several steps behind Michael and Samael and Raphael. And then behind Michael as he grieved the loss of his brother, the brightest of them all, and Raphael grew ever more distant. It was quiet now. So quiet. Opening his eyes, Gabriel stretched his wings and flew, hovering in space outside of Earth's orbit. His true form was ablaze with grace and energy, and his voice rang through space as he called for his family. When nothing but silence met his calls, Gabriel wrapped time and space around him to enter heaven. He was thrown back into his human body, not a vessel, his, when he found himself unable to reach his home. Not by choice, but because his grace, flung back by the emptiness that met him where he had once had heaven, sought the closest thing to home it had, his body on earth. Gasping in air, Gabriel snapped his eyes open, staring directly at the brown bark of the tree that had served as the receptacle for his grace. The arc reactor weighed heavily in his chest, but the pain was inconsequential now. He rooted around in his chest, disintegrated the pieces of shrapnel that still lay there, and then reached for the reactor and pulled it out. The casing it had been in was pulled out scant seconds later, and his grace swirled as it healed the damage Yinsen had wrought when he saved Tony Stark's life. Gabriel looked down at the metal casing in the blue light of the arc reactor that had been keeping his heart pumping and his human self alive for the last 3 months. Smiling wryly, he bent over to dig a small hole. Then he dropped the casing and the now defunct arc reactor inside it, brushing the sand back over it. Keep it safe, huh? He asked the tree, patting the bark fondly as he stood in one smooth motion. Turning his back to the tree, Gabriel rolled his shoulders, stretching his wings at the same time. It was amazing how natural it felt to move his body in comparison to his former vessel. Even after millennia of inhabiting the same vessel, moving it had never come naturally to him. It was like a human wearing clothes, but this body was him for all intents and purposes. His grace roiled inside of him, still unsettled from the sudden displacement from tree to angel, but it was all contained. The might of an archangel contained in a human body, because that was what the archangel had been for 37 years. The memories of his human life were at the forefront of Gabriel's mind now that he had absorbed millions of years as an archangel. While his human persona had been remarkably close to his own personality as Gabriel, there were still notable differences between whom he had been as Tony Stark and whom he was now as Gabriel. And yet, he was still Tony Stark. He was just more now. Taking a deep breath of hot desert air, he looked down at his healed chest, bringing a hand up to cover the spot where the arc reactor had been. Tony Stark was still him, and he was also Gabriel. How had Anael managed this? 2 conflicting sets of personalities and 2 sets of memories that didn't match up. Even after millennia of living with the humans, he'd never understood. And now that he did, now that he had spent time as one, he didn't regret making a stand against Lucifer. Still, he needed to know where his family was. He couldn't enter heaven, he couldn't even find where it was. He couldn't hear the host, and now that he knew why his head was so quiet, it was even worse. There was not even a whisper where there had once been the voices of thousands. Even Castiel's voice, the voice of the little angel who had rebelled in all for love, was unheard. And if Gabriel was cut off by the host, unlikely as it was considering his status as Archangel, he would have heard Castiel because they were 2 peas in pod now, both having been resurrected by their father, since there was no other explanation for Gabriel being alive right now. The apocalypse was obviously not in progress at the moment. He would have noticed that scale of calamity even as a human, and there was no sign of any angels on Earth. For that matter, he couldn't even sense demons, nor were there any signs of other creatures. The Winchesters were famous for hunting werewolves, demons, ghosts, vampires. There was not a whiff of them to be had. But there were other places. As Gabriel set his senses outside of Earth, he could feel the entirety of this universe and more, just hovering on the fringes. Not this universe, but other dimensions. And as he stretched his wings once again, he flitted to each of the places he could sense. Surprised when one led to a new world with a sparkling rainbow bridge. Another was an icy world, another held dwarves, another held elves. He didn't visit the last he could sense, feeling a taint of evil emanating from it that he had no desire to meet at the moment. He returned to Earth, letting his breath escape with a sigh as he opened his eyes to yellow sand. He was alone. So alone. Another exhale, and he pushed back the millions of years of memories as Gabriel the Archangel, letting Tony Stark's come to the forefront. There was no need for Gabriel at the moment, but Tony still had a job. Much to his surprise and pleasure, it turned out that Rhodey had never given up on searching for him. As Tony left the sandbull where his tree had grown for the last 3 decades of 7 years, he reached out to see if he could sense any potential rescuers. He could leave by himself, but that would raise questions that he didn't really feel like answering. When it turned out Rhodey was in the vicinity, Tony didn't think. He unfurled his wings and flew, landing close by, but not so close that they'd be surprised if they suddenly saw him pop up out of thin air. Then he began walking, amazed at how close the sensations he was feeling with his body's senses were now, that he was no longer in a vessel. The hot sand no longer hurt him, and the sun didn't blind him, but he could still feel. It took a little touch of grace for Rhodey's helicopter to find him, but Tony was still utterly, inexplicably relieved to see him. This was his makeshift brother, someone he'd reached out to when he had no idea why he was so lonely, and Rhodey's soul was just as bright as his personality. When Rhodey embraced him after a customary quip, Tony found himself suppressing tears. As it would turn out, he was still human, even with his grace returned. After a perfunctory medical checkup, during which all the doctors were stymied by him, I'm going to stop here and then I'll record the next part of chapter 1. But,